From the internet, the International Jack Benny Fan Club presents the 4th Annual Jack Benny Convention.
Thank you, Zach. Well, welcome to the Johnny Carson panel. And as Zach just said, Johnny Carson often cited that Jack Benny was his idol. And so let me introduce a few panelists. We have the man of 1,000 voices, an impressionist that does the voice of Jack Benny and Johnny Carson, and a frequent guest on The Tonight Show, Rich Little. And then we also have, thank you for being here. And we also have someone where Rich Little appeared on this person's podcast, Mark Malkoff, in his Carson podcast. Yeah, I know, 2 times.
Hi, nice to see you all. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. You follow a lot of people involved in The Tonight Show, and I really appreciate that. One of the people that you also had on your podcast was Dan Pasternack, who met Johnny through working on a documentary about Jack Benny as a teenager. Awesome stories from Dan Pasternack. Can't wait to get into some of that. And also, Kathy has joined us, or did she just go out of focus for a second? There's Kathy. Yeah. All right. Kathy is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where she talks to young people about people like Jack Benny and talks about late night. So I'm really excited to have y'all here. I'm your moderator. I found Jack Benny because I really loved Conan O'Brien, and Conan O'Brien really liked Johnny Carson, of course, and then that's how you get back to Jack Benny. So that's why I wanted to talk about Johnny Carson in this panel. So let's play a clip from The Tonight Show.
And number 1, out of all the voices I do, I said it was 160, I am pleased to announce that this guy was number 1. You know, everybody thinks that I'm stingy. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, money isn't everything. Guys, I wish I had $1 for every time I've said that. Jag.
So here is a preview of the all-new David Brinkley Report.
This is Jack Benny in New York City, you see, and you know.
And this is Johnny Carson in Washington. You go ahead tonight, Jack. I think you go first tonight. I went first last night, and he almost killed me. He would have, but it meant plane fare back to Washington. Now cut that!
You do everybody tremendously. You really do.
But you, Johnny, this is the voice I've worked on for the past 2 years more than any.
I'm not easy to do, really.
And you were not easy to do.
Do I really laugh that way?
The secret, I shouldn't really say this, but the secret of doing a good Johnny Carson is to make sure that your jokes aren't too good. No. It's the comeback. It's those little zingers.
I think that got me bounced from the show.
Oh, no, Rich, you can do them wonderfully. They always had a playful attitude when you were on the Tonight Show. So you're the only one that here on this panel that has known both Johnny and Jack and worked with both of them.
Right.
Do you have any observations or thoughts about getting to work with both of them?
Well, Jack Benny was lovable, kind, sweet, gentle, wonderful man. Probably my favorite of all the people I've met in show business. He had very little ego, and he loved comedy. He loved to laugh. Johnny Carson, there were two Johnny Carsons. There was the Johnny Carson you saw on the air, and everybody loved him, you know, the boy from Nebraska, and quick-witted and funny. And then there was the other Johnny Carson where he didn't talk to anybody, sat in the corner, and kind of brooded. And he wasn't a very happy man in real life. But on camera, he was exactly the opposite.
Yeah. I've listened to a lot of Mark's podcasts, so I know that tends to be an observation that a lot of people have. You also did an interview, since you were on Mark's show twice. Dan also joined you for an interview, and Dan, we've gotten to talking since Mark introduced us. I'm from the Midwest, and so are you. I think you had a question regarding voices of Midwesterners for Rich.
Yes, Mr. Little, such a pleasure. I'm always so fascinated with, masters of voices. Mel Blanc was a dear friend of mine, and I always liked getting inside of his head in terms of the process. I'm curious for you, because you keyed in so brilliantly to both Jack and Johnny, if the key to sort of cracking the code, as it were, for those impressions was the sort of the Midwesternness. And if not, what was it for you? What is it for you that got you inside both of those impressions?
Well, the thing was, Johnny Carson was so popular, and everybody watched the Tonight Show. And, he was probably the most recognizable person in show business. And so to do Johnny Carson, was a must for me. And when I first came down from Canada, I didn't do Johnny Carson. And they wanted me on the Tonight Show. And I said, no, I'm not going on until I could imitate Johnny Carson. And they said, how long will that be? And I said, I don't know. I'm working on it. And then one day I went down to the zoo, and where was it? It was in there was an animal zoo, I think in Phoenix or somewhere, and I was watching the ostriches, and that's how I came to do Johnny Carson, by watching the ostriches.
That's amazing. It's great.
That is amazing. So I was wondering too, Dan, for the people. What? Oh.
No, I was just going to say that the San Diego Zoo, I had a moment there.
Dan, I was going to say, for the listeners that don't know, how did you end up in an interview with Mark Malkoff talking to Rich Little? How did that come about?
Well, actually, I wasn't on Mark's podcast with Mr. Little. I was on with Dick Cavett, and then we did one together with Buck Henry.
That's right.
Where was
Getting
Dick
my
Cavett
facts
from?
confused.
Where was Dick
Nebraska?
Cavett?
He was from Nebraska.
Nebraska. So they both were from Nebraska, right?
Yeah, they bonded. I mean, they met. I mean, Dick was like 10 or 11 when he met Johnny in a church basement. Johnny was doing his magic. And Cavett was just with some friends. But that's when they first met.
They're very
awesome.
similar, actually. Very similar.
That was my observation, was that, and this is, I think, what Hope was alluding to, was that there was a certain commonality that these funny people from the Midwest seemed to find with one another. It was Jack and Johnny, and then Johnny and David Letterman, and Johnny and my friend Jonathan Winters, that all of these great Midwestern funny people seem to connect with each other. Yeah, exactly. That there was something stylistically similar, and also just in terms of, I think, the kind of humor that they exuded. It was very accessible.
Yeah, I agree with that. Did anyone notice like differences how Johnny acted with the Midwestern comics versus some of the others for East Coast, West Coast, other comics?
I personally have talked to people and have done research, and if anybody was from that, like Tom Brokaw was from just I think it was it Utah, but they were still like 30 minutes away, and it was just like this bond, and they played each other in football. So it's like, it was anybody like that, like Cavett and stuff, that Johnny, he definitely would trust them more for 100%. There was even when he went to Vegas, he was playing Vegas one time, and a note got back to him. Somebody who was from his hometown in Nebraska. Never would I be able to meet you afterwards. And they were shocked that Johnny said yes. But Nebraska and with definitely with the Midwest, I think Johnny was definitely let his guard down.
Maybe he owed him money.
Yeah, could have been.
I also think, by the way, there is something about, and Mr. Little, please jump in on this. I think there's something also about Canadians. I've always sort of said that, like, Canadians are sort of like Midwesterners to the north of us. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In terms of
a lot of Canadians became comics. A lot of them. Yeah. I can't name you too many, but there were a number.
Phil Hartman did, I mean, with the voices and stuff,
Yeah.
and Les Sly, who's one of my favorites from childhood. But yeah. I wanted to just interject really quickly, and I just found this out about Benny, that without Benny, Johnny never would have gotten married to Joanna, who was really the love of his life. And what happened is, if you guys know this, Hope, please stop me, but Jack was being honored in May of 1978. He was being honored because he raised, I guess, at that point, $5 million for orchestras around the U.S. He was, a lot of the orchestras were struggling and stuff. So he was getting honored in New York at the Waldorf. And so Johnny was there. Johnny's like, of course, I have to be here for this. And Cavett was here. And then the next night, they all went out to 21. It was the Bennies, and it was Carson and this fashion designer who that was Carson's date, and they were all together at 21 when Johnny spotted Joanna. So I don't think that would have ever happened. And Johnny didn't even talk to Joanna at that point. At that point, he asked his date if you could get Joanne's phone number, which I don't know how that worked, but just the fact that Bennies were there, and Johnny would never have been there. Joanna, people. Yeah. Joanna had not been to had never been to California until 1971. She was a New Yorker. She didn't want to move there, so it's like the geography and stuff. So I thought that was really cool. That because they were definitely. I think that was probably when he was maybe happiest.
That's amazing, because I thought Johnny met all his wives on the beach.
Definitely with Alex. Yeah.
So, we're talking about Jack's influence on Johnny, and so I was just curious, Rich, if you once said that Johnny had about 23 ticks, and I was just curious if any of them also show up with Jack, because I noticed a lot of his earlier work seems to kind of emulate Jack.
Well, Jack, of course, had that looking away, telling a corny joke, or maybe they didn't get it, and then looking to the side. And Johnny picked that up. He did that too. And it was kind of like, do you understand, or do you get it? They'd look away. And it was interesting. The other thing was that Jack, of course, had the hand up to the mouth. And one time he said to me, he said, Rich, I notice you put your hand up to your face when you do me. I said, yeah. Well, you use 4 fingers and I use 3. And everybody knows that 3 is funnier than 4.
Right.
3 is funnier than 4. I'll make a mental note of that. Got to do things in threes.
I think he made that, but it's very.
One thing I do want to interject also is Jack would go on with guest hosts on The Tonight Show as well when Carson wasn't there. Of course, Johnny loved having Jack on. So there's so much videotape that exists of Jack. There's a clip. I haven't seen it, but it's Wayne Newton guest hosting for Johnny, I think in 1973 maybe. And he's playing the violin at the end, and then Jack comes on.
When they got along.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, oh, really? Wayne seems to have problems with lots of people. He had problems then with Benny.
Yeah, well, later on,
Yeah.
Wayne Newton was not a fan of Johnny Carson's. I can tell you that.
That is,
but I think
that is an understatement.
In the early days, he
hours.
was.
Yeah.
He was in the early days, and he, as you said, he was on the Tonight Show hosting it. That's true.
Yeah, so Benny was on, but Tony was, Wayne was playing violin, and then Jack did a walk on. So there's lots of stuff I would love to see that somewhere that still exists with Jack going on.
Yeah, well, Wayne Newton has that clip in his show, Wayne Newton has that clip with Jack Benny in his show, doing now in Vegas. Yeah. If you want to see it, go and see Wayne Newton.
And if you want to see Big Sean destroy the set of The Tonight Show, which I still have never seen because you lost the tape and you found it, people have been emailing me around the country seeing your show, Rich, and people finally get to see that famous clip that it was folklore and you have it.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
He destroyed the set. Destroyed it.
I wanted to point out is that little clip that we saw when Mr. Little was guest hosting The Tonight Show, I believe was Jack's very last appearance on The Tonight Show.
Yes. And we talked on the show about Jack doing Sunshine Boys. We talked about that on the show, and Jack was really looking forward to doing that with Walter Matthau. And it's interesting, as you said, because a couple of months later he passed away, and that's when George Burns took over. Yeah.
How did he seem? Did he seem like he was not at all well when he appeared with you that time?
Not at all. No, not at all. As a matter of fact, when the show was over taping, Jack said, listen, we've got to go down to the commissary and get some chicken soup. I said, why? It's the best chicken soup in the world, and I've got to have it. Come on, let's go. And we went down there, and the door was locked. And Jack's pounding on the door. It's Jack Benny. Open up. I want some chicken soup. And the cleaning lady came, opened up the door, and Jack took all the soup in the refrigerator and walked off with it.
Fantastic.
Oh my God, Mark! Did you know that story, Mark?
Which one? No, this one.
And he walked right in and Lucille Ball and said, Lucy, I hate to interrupt you. She was in the middle of shooting a scene. And he said, but I want you to try this chicken soup. It's fabulous. And Lucille Ball looked at him and said, Jack, I don't like chicken soup.
I can see that Lucy delivery.
Yes. It's great.
Jack was funny.
Oh.
Jack was funny that little things in life really pleased him. You know, like he'd say, "I love to play the Palmer House in Chicago because the towels are so fluffy." You know, I can hardly get them in my suitcase.
Oh, that was awesome.
I think I mentioned it last year, perhaps I didn't, that Johnny, when he was 17, hitchhiked to California, and it was really the first time on his own he could go around. And the first thing he did was get a star map and go to Jack Benny's house and just wait outside. And he never came out, but like that just is so telling that's the first thing Carson really wanted to do.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
He idolized him that much, huh? Wow.
Yeah. And you know that he did his undergraduate thesis at the University of Nebraska as an audio, a 45-minute audio tape where he talks about Jack Benny and Fred Allen. And the University of Nebraska has digitized it, and you can hear it for free through their library website because Carson has generously gave a whole lot of money to his alma mater. And it's a 22-year-old Johnny Carson. It's just fabulous.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he really went far in his love of comedy, and it's so deep. Now, Dan, you also are a huge fan of comedy, and it went back pretty far when you were trying to get a documentary about Jack Benny. How old were you? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So when I was 15 years old, I essentially reached out to every person I could that was tangentially connected to Jack Benny and the Jack Benny Show to try and make this salute that was I called Remembering Benny, and interviewed on camera Mel Blanc, Dennis Day, Frank Nelson, Herb Vigran, the sound effects man Ray Erlenborn, Freddy De Cordova, two of Jack's writers, George Balzer and Milt Josephsberg. I mean, everyone I could. And in fact, when I interviewed Freddy De Cordova, obviously being, a kid with a lot of chutzpah, I said, "Do you think there's any chance that Johnny would?" And I couldn't even get the sentence out. It was like, yeah, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But the thing that did happen was that I came back at Mr. De Cordova's invitation and got to sit with Johnny in his office and talk about Jack. And it's one of the most memorable experiences of my life. I have no pictures of it. I have no video of it. But I will tell you, he was as engaged as any human being I've ever spoken to. He locked eyes with me. He really wanted to know why I was interested in Jack Benny. And he told me a couple of things that I'd never heard him say in an interview before. One of the things that he had said is that not only was Jack his idol, but that he studied every aspect of his show, and that there were elements that he held on to and thought about as he was putting together The Tonight Show. That the reason he liked Ed McMahon is he reminded him of Don Wilson, that he had the same ebullience that Don Wilson had, and that he needed someone who could exude that kind of warmth and interact with him. And he said, because his original band leader, I think he inherited from, I want to say Parr, because Skitch Henderson was the original band leader, right, on the Tonight Show with Carson. But then when he had the opportunity to install Doc Severinsen, he said that he liked Doc Severinsen's flamboyance because it reminded him of Phil Harris.
Huh. Wow.
So to have that conversation with Johnny Carson when I was making a Jack Benny documentary and hear him say these things, this is 10 years after Jack had passed, and he was very generous in sharing these things with me. I mean, I'll remember it for the rest of my life.
You know, I was a no book. I was a no book on the Tonight Show. I did it. I hosted it 32 times, and then something happened, and I never found out why. Maybe it was the fact that I said I do a Johnny Carson, a good Johnny Carson, when the jokes aren't too good. Maybe that was the end of my relationship. I don't know. But anyway, I met Johnny Carson in Malibu about a year before he passed away. And I was sitting at a table and he came over to me. And I thought, maybe he doesn't like me because I never finished doing the Tonight Show. I was a no book, but he was very friendly. And he came over to the table and he said to me, "Rich, are you still doing me in your act?" I said, "Yes, I am, John." "You're kidding." "But I haven't been on television for a couple of years." I said, "I know." "Well, you're doing me in your act, really? Do people remember me?" I said, "Of course they do, John. They will remember you for a long time." "I don't think so, because I've been off the air. I'm surprised at that. I really am." I said, "John, really, I'm doing you now, and isn't it funny? I remember that happening, and here we are, like 40 years later, and I'm still doing Johnny Carson." Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it
And
really is.
I will say it will remain the gold standard of Johnny Carson impressions.
Yes, I agree with that. And do you still do Jack at all at any of your shows?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I do. I do George Burns, Jack Benny, and Johnny Carson. And of course, my audience are older. Young people don't know who they are. Well, some people do, but generally speaking, young people don't know the past. They're only interested in their phones. But anyway, I do all three of them in my act. And as I said, the audience is older and they all love them. I mean, oh my God, I can't tell you which one gets the biggest reaction. Probably George Burns, because he lived longer, and people remember him from Oh God movies, But I still do Jack Benny and Johnny Carson, and I keep thinking, God, 50 years ago, Johnny said to me, "Rich, nobody knows me," So it's funny, when I think about it. But with an older crowd, they're still very popular, very.
Yeah, that is so good to hear. I was just wondering, Paul, if you could play some of the photos that we have of can't talk Dan's today to talk where he was interviewing. Yeah. So Dan, you said you don't have those interviews. What happened to that project?
Oh no! I have them. They're all on.
You have them.
All on.
You have them. Okay, but okay.
So what I did was that's me and Milt Josephsberg on the couch in his house, and you'll see behind us is the framed cover of his book, The Jack Benny Show. I do have all of the interviews. So I have, since 1996, I've been conducting archival interviews for the Television Academy's Oral History Project. And so I donated my original half-inch tapes to the Television Academy. They've digitized them, they've cleaned them up, and hopefully we'll be making them all available via their portal. And they're terrific. I have both Milt and Frank Nelson telling their versions of the famous Dreer Poussin story. There's me with Frank and his wife Viola Vaughn in their home. By the way, fun fact, there is a picture behind over my shoulder of Viola's first husband, Hanley Stafford, who was daddy on Baby Snooks. And when Hanley passed away, that's when she and Frank got together. And I was very dear friends with Frank and Viola. They were just absolutely wonderful people.
Wow. I do a lot of sketches of the people that I imitate, you know, and I did one of Johnny Carson. And can you see that?
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow. That's really good.
Johnny Carson. And I did
Rick,
Jack Benny, too.
Rick, your whole home
100.
has those all over the place. They're amazing framed.
This is the one of Jack Benny.
These are fantastic.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
I'll charge you for looking at them.
No, your house, Rich, it's like a museum. You have those all over the place. You've done like maybe, I don't know, dozens of them and stuff.
You know, a line I use. You know, a line I use in my show right now. You know, I have Jack saying, a lot of people think that I'm cheap. You know, well, I'm not cheap. Last night I phoned up a hooker and asked her what night she was free.
That's great.
I don't,
Oh,
you know,
Jack Benny.
something about Jack Benny I'm curious about. I never saw him angry or upset, and I'm sure he was. Everybody gets upset, but I tried to picture Jack Benny being upset, being angry, and it just I can't visualize it, but I'm sure he was. You know, he was such a sweet man. Now, Johnny Carson, I've seen many times. I've seen Johnny when he was furious, but I've never seen Jack when he was angry. You know, I wonder if there's anything we could see that shows Jack getting upset. Probably not. Probably not.
I've never heard a single story about Jack losing his temper.
Yeah.
Oh, you should ask Freddy De Cordova about that. He could tell you about it.
Don't get upset.
Well,
He must have, but I've never seen that ever. No, I agree. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's crazy.
he saved
Yeah.
it from my research. He saved it for off mic. He could get very angry if you were late for radio rehearsal, and he fired Eddie Anderson a couple times. So he could get upset, and oh, how upset he got when Harry Kahn, his first writer, walked out on him. So that's even, yes. So he kept those things off camera. Let's just say, I think.
Yeah, he probably didn't shout, right? He didn't shout. He probably, you know, we're not going to use you anymore. You know, that's probably what he said. You know, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
I also
Wow,
want to
thank you
point
for
out
that, Kathy.
what.
No, I was just thinking, Kathy, what do you want to point out, Mark?
Oh, I was just going to say really quickly, I think it's very telling with people that were kind of uncomfortable around Johnny. Like David Letterman, just always around Johnny, was always in awe and just a little bit like, what do I say? But he was saying the last time he ever saw Johnny on the yacht going around New York, when it was awkward, he would always go back to bring up Jack Benny, and Carson was fine and engaged. And that would be, I think that would have been the thing. If you were around Carson and he was, you know, like introverted at bringing up Jack and having any knowledge, I think, yeah, be a different person. But I thought that was interesting that Dave used that as a defense mechanism, and it worked.
Yeah, that is a good point. He did connect with Johnny, anything with Jack was a good bet for connecting with Johnny. So we were talking about Jack getting mad. So I actually have a question for Rich. You once said that you do certain voices for people, and you respond better with certain voices of people, like Johnny Carson. You'll have a good comeback, a snappy comeback. Do you do any voices in your act now? Do you get many hecklers that you respond with voices to them, or?
Well, I did get a lot of flack when I did Joe Biden, but this was about a year ago. Now I don't get any flack at all because, unfortunately, everybody knows he's Mr. Magoo, you know. But that's the only one that people have walked out on when I did Joe Biden. But as I said, now there's very few liberals in my audience because I have older people and they're They're smart.
So that makes sense. That makes sense.
You know who didn't like my impression was Paul Lynn. Hated my impression. Oh my God. He'd look into the camera when I would do him and he'd say, "Who's he doing? That's disgusting. Get a day job." He hated my impression. Paul Lynn
Also,
did.
Robert Stack. Robert Stack didn't like you, your impression.
Paul Lynn was
sure.
not a very happy person. Paul Lynn wasn't, you know. He reminds me a little bit about Johnny Carson in that Paul Lynn was so loved on camera on Hollywood Squares and Dean Martin and everything. But in real life, he was kind of strange and miserable. I'm not saying that Johnny was miserable, but he wasn't the same person off camera as on, you know. And Paul Lynn, oh my God, he could be vicious, really. And he drank too much too. Sometimes we had to strap him into the square after the lunch break because he was totally out of his mind. And he still was funny. He could be like totally drunk, and he still was funny. I don't know how he did that, you know. I guess it was just his image, you know. The only time on Hollywood Squares they had to stop the tape was when Paul said the F word, and everybody was shocked, and they had to stop the tape. That was the only time they ever stopped the tape on The Tonight Show. But Paul Lynn was, he was a strange man. Anyway,
so
why are we talking about Paul Lynn?
So Paul didn't like your impression of him, but who were some of your favorite impressions to do, or what were some of Johnny and Jack's favorite impressions that you did?
Well, it's funny you should mention that because Jack loved my impression of Spiro Agnew. That shows you how long ago. I'm not kidding you. He came on the show one time. Jack,
you're not still doing Spiro Agnew.
I only came on the show tonight to hear Rich do Spiro Agnew, you know, and it's true. He loved my Spiro Agnew. I don't know why, but I guess they must have been friends or something. But when I did Spiro Agnew on The Tonight Show, if you watch Jack, he's absolutely in his glory. It's unbelievable. They must have been friends, you know. I can't picture them together, but they must have been friends. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they were.
They golfed together. They used to play golf together.
They used to play golf together. Okay.
Did Jack play golf? Did Jack play golf? Huh? Did Jack play golf?
Oh yeah.
Yes. Yep. He did. Was he good? Was he good?
Nah.
Or did he move the cup shorter to the ball? Did he move the cup shorter to the ball?
Well, I believe that he is occasionally attributed with the line of, "Give me a beautiful day, a great golf course, and a beautiful player, and you can keep the day and the golf course."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, Mark, I did want to ask.
Was Jack a player? Yeah. Was Jack a player? Did he fool around, or should I ask that question? Not that I'll get an answer, but
well, Jack loved the ladies.
He loved the ladies.
Yeah,
I think George did too. George did too, didn't he?
Yeah.
That combination of George Burns and Jack Benny always fascinated me. They absolutely idolized each other because mainly Jack would break up at everything George did, and it was hysterical. But I used to see that too at parties, you know, and when Jack would just get up at a party and go up to the mantle and take a cigarette out of the package and start to light it, and then George would say, "Hold it, everybody. Jack is going to do the famous match trick." And then Jack lit his cigarette, and George said, "Oh, new finish."
One other thing I wanted to share with you, when I had my one-on-one with Johnny Carson, he asked if I was going to be talking to George, and I had already interviewed Irving Fine, and I had met George. But I said, gee, I hope, we can get him on camera. Johnny reached onto his bookshelf, and he handed me a copy of this book called I Love Her, That's Why. This was, I think, George's first book he'd ever written, and he said, you should read this because Jack wrote the prologue for it. So he lent me this book, and I did not realize until I had a flood in my house in Atlanta, I never returned the book. This is Johnny Carson's copy of the book, and in fact, when I looked in it in Atlanta, there's an inscription to Johnny from George.
Oh boy. Oh, that's great. That's wonderful.
That is
great.
wonderful.
So I did not know until just a few years ago that I never returned Johnny Carson's book that he so kindly lent me.
Do you remember when Jack used to hand out money clips? Do you remember that? He would hand out money clips and that you put in money into. And I have one of those still, that he gave me.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing.
I remember one time at the Sands Hotel, I came in very late, 4 a.m, and Jack was playing the nickel machine. And it was 4 a.m. I said, Jack, what are you doing? It's 4 a.m. And he said, well, I'm going to stay here until the string breaks. He was really funny when he wasn't on camera. He was the same, actually. He satirized himself, the cheapness. He was not a cheap man, by the way. He wasn't cheap. I went to breakfast with him once, and he picked up the check, and I fainted on the floor. When he broke up when I did that. But he was a generous person. He really was. He just had that image, and he played it to the hilt. I'm telling you. Oh my God, he could be a very funny person to be around.
He really could, from what I've heard. We have only a couple of minutes left, so I have two kind of really quick questions, and I'll ask you, Mark. You interviewed Joan Benny, and what did she have to say about her about her father's relationship with Johnny Carson?
Oh, they spent Joan and Johnny were actually really close. They had dinner in Vegas and stuff, and it was just everything. He was just Joan was telling me just Johnny would be in awe of her father. When the wake, when the date when he died and stuff, Johnny was in the house, and it was just like Johnny did not go to funerals almost ever. Or see people in public cry. That might have been the only time he publicly, just couldn't uncontrollably was Jack's funeral. I think we might have talked about that.
That's funny you should say that, because Johnny one time said to me that I hate funerals. He said, I never go to a funeral. As a matter of fact, I hate funerals so much, I'm not going to mine.
He wouldn't go to them. He wouldn't go to them normally because he didn't want to take away from the deceased, like if they were not famous. But if somebody was famous and they were there and the other famous people were around, Carson felt more comfortable because the last thing he would want to do is just be the subject of attention and take attention away. And he was, as Rich said, maybe the most recognizable person in America.
I know that we don't want this to end because I have so many more questions and everything, but we are definitely gonna have to wrap this up. It's so sad when things end. But I thank you all so much for all of your conversation, because I can't believe how amazing this has been. We have audience comments that we didn't even get to. Thank you so much. Rich, Dan, Mark, Kathy. It's honestly, this is the best best panel I've been on. Thank you.
Thank you, Hope. Great job putting this together.